we had a very interesting session where we had a presentation which spoke to the greening that is required, rather, what were the opportunities for the greening. But through the session, and the key messages that came out were the following. I have 5 of them. The first was that despite everything, there is a tinkering at the edges. So for OECD, how will OECD help pressure or provide the knowledge products to ensure that this tinkering moves to real constructive change in the mineral sector? The revisiting of the opportunities and the trade-offs, but also very clearly looking at issues of value retention and reduction of mining. There was also a reference to sufficiency in this last session. That was not used in our session, but that was what was intended, in the sense that is there an opportunity to be able to reduce the amount of primary materials so that there is less of a human and environmental footprint. The second point, and this was strongly made many times, was that the industry needs to understand the business case, and that the business case is embedded in being proactively addressing the risks linked with climate and the environment, as well as social risks. Not to wait for regulation to create this change, but to recognize that it needs to be proactive. The third point was about behavioral shifts, and OECD is already doing a lot of work in this, and you might want to do more. So behavioral shifts required of the consumer, of the whole consumption value chain, but also of the mining companies. The point number 4 was that, and this did not come out just in that session, but also later, how do we support that arguments like circularity, sustainable management of minerals becomes more embedded in the institutional change in countries? It's one thing to talk about this in conferences, but where do we make that link? And one idea was to have a clear narrative linking ideas like circularity to the planetary crises. The last point, and this is not new to anyone, is to internalize the externalities of mining. So the more you internalize it, the more the product will reflect these externalities, the more the opportunities to address these externalities are moving forward.
We really were looking at how do we get the trade that we want, which is the contribution of trade to the circular economy, be that in the comparative advantage or economies of scale that will give us more recycling globally, whether that's leading to less primary resource use as we reuse materials more, or longer lifespans for products as they're used secondhand in a range of markets. So there's trade we want in the circular economy, but there's also trade that we don't want. And how do we avoid the trade we don't want, which is when we export the problem without the solution, either the illegal trade in hazardous waste, or we're exporting waste to countries that are ill-equipped to deal with it safely. So there were 3 sort of main clusters, I guess, of issues that come about. The first is a question of definition, and we found that we're using an umbrella term for actually some very different kinds of activities. One being trade in waste, another being trade in secondary materials, and another being trade in second-hand goods. And those all are slightly different, but we're sort of grouping them together. And this is further complicated by the fact that there aren't clear dividing lines between those 3 activities. So one woman's waste is another woman's secondary material or commodity for reuse. So what this means is it has implications not just for understanding what's going on in terms of having data and having statistics and knowing what trade is happening, but it also has implications for the kind of policy solutions and approaches that we might come up with. So one example that was talked about was that, we have a number of countries who are very concerned about importing waste. And in fact, even the definition of hazardous waste is changing. So some plastics are now being considered hazardous waste. At the same time, in some other countries, companies want to re-import their old equipment back because they want to try and reuse it or reclaim materials from it, but they can't re-import it because it falls under the definition of waste, which is not accepted as an import. So this is closely linked to the next sort of cluster of issues, which was really about regulation and standards. So trade is essentially about exchange across difference, and that difference tends to be very much aided by or underpinned by international standards, or at least the interoperability of national standards. And there was a little bit of a discussion about the complexity as well of private standards. So I think there was a lot of feeling that harmonisation is some way off. But that said, we're not starting from zero. We do have regulations and tools available, be that the Basel Convention or some of the OECD instruments. But on standards in particular, there was a sense that we do need, even if we can't get to harmonisation, we do need to progress more on some kind of mutual recognition or certification or some greater understanding, and that transparency and data sharing are a minimum beginning of that. But more than that, we needed some kind of shared understanding on some of the key concepts, such as quality of materials for recycling processes, and on what is waste or hazardous waste. But as the discussion showed, standards raise a number of tricky issues. They're very hard to develop. You need a capacity to monitor compliance, although digital and blockchain can help. There are issues about whether we should regulate now, such as in design for recyclability, or whether if we regulate too quickly, we'll hamper the very innovation that is going to give us something different. Do we need regulation? Do we do industry standards? And how do we approach the question that there can be legitimate differences in standards amongst countries? And how do we manage that situation? Which leads me to the final sort of cluster of issues, which is about cooperation. So there's some very big gains, but I think there was some discussion that showed that adjustment won't be cost-free, and that effective circular economy is going to require many actors to play a part. So in terms of some of the transition, business was pointing out that this is fundamentally changing a bunch of things, from income to costs to tax treatment, and that the existing regulatory frameworks are all based on a different model. For consumers, there's a need to generate a demand for recycled content and also a willingness to actually repair and reuse. And a serious issue for those countries, especially developing countries, who are largely commodity exporters, and what the impact may be when you're using less primary inputs. And a number of questions that were raised about coordination and competition issues. So can all producers, be they small producers or foreign producers, be part of consultation? Can they be part of extended producer responsibility schemes? And what does it mean if they're not? What does it mean to have export restrictions on secondary waste, and especially when that can serve essentially as an input subsidy for another domestic industry? Import bans on waste in one country lead to a shift of that trade to other countries, which may or may not be well equipped to handle that. And who is responsible for irresponsible trade? Do we leave it to the issues of markets, of buyers and sellers? Do we have regulation? Is it the exporting country? Where's the collective action solution there? And the difference in incentives between using primary inputs or secondary, depending on the pricing. So global solutions required. Maybe three last quick observations that came up about what could the OECD do. I guess firstly, more transparency about what's going on, unpacking, mapping the different issues across the different types of trade, across the different sectors. Secondly, looking at the implications and trade-offs. Who is affected and how as we move towards a more circular economy. And lastly, exploring where standards or regulations might be helpful, including in creating new market demand and just mapping the current regulatory environment.
The focus of our session was on regions and extractive industries and how to promote a more inclusive and sustainable local economic development. So we had speakers represented local authorities, private sector, trade union, but also research and universities. So they all said that the transition to a low-carbon economy at regional level is both a short-term and a long-term agenda. And so, of course, we have been looking very much at these issues from a regional and local development perspective. The main message from the session are the following. First, I mean, we said that solutions are very different from one place to another, and they need to be tailored to the different context. In other words, we need to place-based policies, an industry approach which can support a more inclusive and sustainable development. So solution tailored to the different context. There is a need also to develop both, as I said, a short-term agenda and a longer-term policy and industry agenda. And many speakers insisted that both approaches are needed, and that to a certain extent, the longer-term agenda is more difficult to implement. Second, to identify these solutions, all participants raised the importance of establishing a proper social dialogue, engaging all stakeholders, including workers and the local communities. And in this context, there is a clear key role to be played by local authorities to design and implement place-based policies and develop solutions. This was highlighted by all speakers. Third, it is critical to develop sustainable value chain and SMEs at the local level. This includes, for example, promoting cross-sectors cooperation. Some mention, for example, linkages between mining and forestry, and bottom-up approaches coming from local entrepreneurs. Speakers mentioned that local services to extractive industries can provide important opportunities for job creation and local business development. Very often, direct jobs related to the extractive sector will not be that big, but indirect jobs have a lot of potential, especially for local services. And finally, fourth, we had a bit of discussion on data and evidence-based analysis. This is still very much missing. We have a few data, but still not enough to support all of this agenda that we just spoke about. So we need to do a big effort to improve the measurement and the monitoring of these issues at subnational level.
We look at the perspective of developing countries that are heavily reliant on extractive industries, and it is clear that the more technological breakthroughs will push for green technologies, and the more our world become low carbon or carbon constraints, the more these countries that rely on fossils and extractive industries will face constraints for their development trajectories. So these countries need to prepare for the inevitable transition. And so we are working with them to see how they can save today for the rain or the different days, the green days of tomorrow, let's put it this way. And this has implications in terms of how they spend it, so the use of funds, sovereign wealth funds or investment funds, and how they tax it. And so together with Grace colleagues and the Intergovernmental Forum, we are looking at how these countries can better tax and avoid base erosion and profit shifting in the mining sector. So this is prepare, get ready for the greenish day, let's put it this way. Second is upgrade, is the issue of resource efficiency. This is still, many countries still have a very long way to go in terms of improving the resource efficiency. So this is another area where we're looking at how the extractive industry can contribute to improve this resource efficiency, including by changing the energy mix of the extractive industry itself. In many developing countries, mining is the single biggest consumer of energy. So if this sector were to adopt renewable energies or improve the resource efficiency, there would be big gains for everybody. Third key word is deploy, meaning deploying several tools. It's not realistic to think that developing countries that are heavily reliant on extractive industries will move from overnight to a greener development path. So it's a transition, it's a path, and there are several issues that need to be considered in this transition. And in the framework of the policy dialogue, we're looking at different tools that can be different aspects that can be comprised in this toolkit, a mix of solutions that include, first, as I mentioned, enhancing energy efficiency, second, integrating renewables in upstream operation of the extractive sector to reduce carbon intensity, third, exploring fuel switching from coal to gas, fourth, reducing methane emission in the upstream operation by avoiding flaring and venting, Fifth, deploying carbon capture and storage technologies. And sixth, helping the diversification of the investment portfolio by investing more in solar and wind power generation. Specifically in relation to the adoption of life cycle approaches, this is something that we have been discussing in relation to capturing CO2 and use it elsewhere. But again, it's not something that is going to happen overnight, and that requires, for sure, the development of the right type of infrastructures, the development of appropriate regulation on transboundary transport of CO2, and the creation of a market for CO2. My last point, last but not least, is finance. It's clearly, it was said by many here that technologies and regulation and policies are important, but the financing of those is also very important. And just to mention the case of Africa, we released the day before yesterday, Grace, I think, the latest issue of tax revenue statistics in Africa. And when you see the average tax to GDP ratio in the continent, we cover 26 26 countries, it's still in the range of 17%. And in the OECD it's 34%, in Latin America it's 23%. So how can you finance policies when tax revenues are so low? It's a mystery. And if you take a country like Nigeria tax to GDP ratio is below 6%, which is quite appalling. So working on that is very important, and we'll continue to do that.
The fiscal issues, and we looked really at two different issues during our panel. We first looked at the issue of the resource-rich countries having to transition to a low carbon economy and what the challenges they would have in doing so. And then separately, we looked at the countries that actually use fossil fuels and would have to transition away from a dependence on the tax revenues associated with the use of those fossil fuels, in particular in the area of transport. And in both cases, I think the discussions led to the conclusion that in both types of countries, we desperately need a plan B. And there are different plan Bs for each one. When you talk about countries that are very highly dependent on the fossil fuels and the sales of those fossil fuels, the exploitation of those, you have a situation where in many cases those countries are deriving more than 50% of their revenues from that. So that is a very big transition. How do you do that? Well, in some sense, the easy answer is diversify, but when you look at specific countries, that is not at all easy. And there was the specific example of landlocked countries, other countries, for example, like Kazakhstan can do other things. They have a more diverse economy. They're a bit more developed than some other countries. And so that, I think, is the big area where further work needs to be done, is to look more specifically at how these countries can transition, taking into account the specific local circumstances. That was very clearly brought out, I think, in our panel. The other big thing that came out, not only from our panel, but of course, from the opening remarks, both of the Secretary General and the keynote speaker, Adair Turner, was the importance of using tax as a tool in this transition. And I think people agree on that. Then the question is, how do you manage that? How do you convince people, first, the governments, to use the tax system in order to try and further this transition? And then second, how do you convince your citizens that these taxes are worthwhile for the broader goal of saving the planet? And so we have seen, certainly in France, and I know I was delayed in getting here because of the tractors on the périphérique, which are blocking traffic. But we've had the Gilets jaunes for over a year. We've seen in Ecuador and other countries that these types of taxes or the removal of subsidies for fossil fuels can have really dire consequences economically and politically when you have a backlash. And so the political economy issues are quite important. I think that is an area where we at the OECD need to work much more on, and with our economics department, because this is not really, it's not an environmental issue anymore. It's an economics issue. How do you structure the tax system? How do you persuade the public that this is really something quite important? And so those were, I would say, some big takeaways from this, but also important areas to focus on. The other thing I would say is that when we look for benchmarks, and people often look to Norway, and I look at my colleague who participated on the panel from Norway, it's a great example in terms of the sovereign wealth fund that they have developed, the types of tax tools they have used. They are looking at the whole issue of the increasing electrification of motor vehicles and what that means to a reduction in the tax revenues that they derive from the taxes typically imposed on transport. And so they're doing a lot of great things, but the Norwegian model, as good as it is, may not be a great benchmark for lesser developed countries, which are in a completely different situation. And so, again, more tailor-made approaches need to be considered. So I think maybe I'll just say one more thing. One of the things that we should look at is when we are shifting taxes to bad activities instead of good activities, we need to look at this very carefully and use this as a tool, but also keep in mind that some of these changes may not happen so quickly, which gives us an opportunity to plan for these Plan Bs. So a lot of work to be done in the Plan B area. Thank you.
Thank you. And can we assume or expect that there's some of these issues that you just raised are being addressed in your future work in your directorate?
Well, as you know, we are doing an awful lot of work on putting a price on carbon. So we will continue that work. We will continue to explore some of these issues, yes, and certainly the issue of the political economy of how to move ahead is something we will be looking at very closely, and as I said, with other parts of the organization.
Maybe I can just sort of pick up from where I left off, really, because in some of the areas that emerged today on the circular economy, I think the aim of the Trade and Agriculture Directorate would be to be working joined up with our colleagues in environment on this. We have a joint working party on trade and environment that does this work, and we have a shared project which we do on measuring fossil fuel subsidies. So I think just as we spent a long time talking today about the need for joined up policies, it's probably something we can do institutionally as well. But maybe to talk just briefly about some of the areas where from a trade perspective we can contribute some insights. And I think one of them is when we think about the trade impacts of some of this. And I think one of the areas is when we think about new trade opportunities. And one of the challenges when we talk about transitions is often, the delta is from here's the trade now, and then you look at it and there's a whole bunch of minuses for people. Because what we're really bad at is assessing with accuracy where the new opportunities are, where the next trade is coming from. And that's particularly true when the next trade is services, which much of this will be, because we're bad at measuring it and we're bad at capturing it. So I think there's a lot to be said about how global trade transforms in response to these kinds of changes, which is also a positive story. And if we can sometimes get stuck on what will happen in one particular sector rather than looking more broadly. And the example of what happened to textiles and clothing, I think, is a good one on that. I guess the second in relation to that too is in terms of how we think about changes in trade in a global economy with global value chains, but also more than that, a global economy where when we're bringing in transitions, we're doing so in an area where there is no shortage of distortions. So a lot of this is about where activities can best take place in terms of comparative advantage, in terms of where it makes sense. But actually, when we look across, we see that there's a role of large amounts of non-transparent government support that actually move activities to areas where maybe they shouldn't be. And we also see the effects of other kinds of trade restrictions as well, which shift the location of global value chains, and it shifts who benefits. So some of these are areas where a country is exercising a legitimate privilege on its standards. Others is where we're actually seeing activities being sent to the wrong place for all the wrong reasons. And unpacking what is legitimate support and what's not is part of the work that we thought about a lot in the Trade Directorate. As I often say, nobody ever says of a subsidy, you know, we're handing truckloads of cash to vested interests. You know, there's always a really good reason for a subsidy. And I guess the job of many of us along here is to work out what we're looking at. Are we looking at one of the good ones, or are we looking at one of the other sort? I think that the second sort of area related to that is in terms of this whole issue of standards, and to make sure that trade rules are supportive of the kind of transition that we're trying to have, and that the kinds of disciplines of transparency, non-discrimination and no more trade restrictive than necessary are actually supportive in this way. And as well, looking at whether our ability to identify goods in the trading system and identify and define them is also supportive of this process. Maybe one last comment is in terms of the broader issue on cooperation. As I mentioned already, there are competitive effects, there are collective action problems with a lot of this, and being able to sift through those, I think, is important. So as we look along with my neighbours on both sides at issues like border carbon adjustment, I think, you know, bringing the perspective from an international trading system, which I admit is perhaps not a paragon of cooperation at the moment, but nonetheless that's the aim, is to really look at who pays, who benefits, and how can we shift a collective action problem towards a better global outcome.
I would like to pass on the floor to Alain again. So he is the representing the Center for Entrepreneurship, SMEs, Regions and Cities.
Thank you. So in particular, with the Regional Development Policy Committee, which is covering not only regional policy, but also urban policy and rural policies, but also as a specific working party working on territorial indicators. So in particular, further work can be done under the auspices of this committee. First, I would like to mention the work that we just started on local green finance, which is done by the committee itself, which is developing comparative data on subnational government finance related to environment and climate action. So this is based on a standard methodology. This is related to many international initiatives, in particular the UNSG Climate Action Summit. We made a presentation there, but it's also related to a number of other important topics. And I think this new type of data can be really instrumental to support our discussion. With the Working Party on Rural Areas, I already mentioned the work that we are doing and that we are continuing on mining regions and cities. Again, with the same focus, which is about regional development and how can we make these mining regions more productive, how can we work on economic diversification, quality of life and well-being, but also governance and fiscal arrangements. So we are working on all of these issues. It's an ongoing project. We have already 2 or 3 years of experience. We'll have a next meeting in Australia in June. We are also cooperating to some extent with DEV on this and with the Development Center, and Federico just mentioned the work that they are doing. So I think this work, from what I heard today, could really continue to provide very inspirational, good practice and policy guidance to many countries and regions. We are also tackling, because within the RDPC, I think we did more with the urban group on the transition to a low carbon economy, but to a certain extent, we were less active with a rural working party. So we just agreed, and we had the meeting last week, so we agreed with members, and this was a clear request by members, to put much more of a focus on the transition to a low-carbon economy with rural areas engaged. So we just issued a recent paper on that, and we are now defining what will be the main actions or activities to be tackled, but this is really an area which is moving now and which is also a big priority of all countries. Finally, with a working party on urban policy, we are active in developing a territorial approach to the SDGs. So this is ongoing work. We had a number of events on this, but we just also issued a specific paper on that. We also have a very active program on the circular economy in cities and regions, which is receiving big success and demand. But now we are thinking about developing an integrated approach to the Paris Agreement, so the role of regions and cities. So this is a new program that will start in 2020 to support this approach and to help national, regional and local governments to develop coherent mitigation and adaptation policy across level of government. And finally, there is also new work on the potential for energy efficiency in building in cities and regions. So yes, we are doing a lot, and I think it will continue to be on the agenda. And I would say even more, it will be even more important on the agenda than never ever before. And I think there is a lot of potential there for the RDPC, the committee, to work closer with the environmental policy committee, but also with trade, because we discuss a number of trade issues today.
We need more regulation in the environment side to solve the problems that we are facing right now. Let me give you the example of the things that we will do after this global materials resources outlook. We will be doing next year the global plastics outlook to 2060. And now we know that we need to talk about, how to redesign plastic products. Many countries, cities, regions are banning single-use plastics. They need to, the industry, the chemicals industry needs to redesign the products, but we have to talk about the economy of new kind of plastics that are coming from biomass. There will be new industries in this field, and I think that we need to add that part. And if we talk about the circularity of the plastics, how we can recycle this capture that is captured in the plastic without any damage to the ocean, for example, to the water, to the environment at all. We need to avoid cross media pollution problems. Because construction materials represents half of materials used today, I think that we need to do more on construction and building life cycle. And I'll also talk about data that we need to collect, and we don't have enough life cycle indicators and data. We are always using the same end of pipeline information when we talk about environmental issues, or even when we talk about, for example, taxes that are not promoting the circularity of the economy. So we have to have new indicators with the life cycle approach.
We heard that strategies and roadmaps for those heavy industry and extractive sectors have been or are being elaborated to promote low carbon technologies and more efficient and circular resource use. And actually, those strategies and roadmaps for decarbonizing those sectors are being or have already been elaborated, and that the technologies exist. So in fact, this is something that I learned as well, that there are many things already being developed. And of course, where we heard about the efficient and circular business models that have been not just being contemplated, but also being implemented in countries. And this will certainly enable us to come closer to achieving our climate goals. And it was also highlighted that innovations in both technologies and business models are certainly needed, but at the same time, the thinking and actually implementation have already started. And of course, this is the very important part. Governments have a critical role in enabling innovation and change through their, of course, the policy tools they have, but also through, if I may put it this way, a nudge or encouragement or even raising awareness. And there were, of course, the critical issue of fiscal implications that the low carbon transition creates for both the resource-rich and importing countries, and of course the difficulty of transition in terms of fiscal policy for certain countries, and the role of trade. And we really want to ensure, of course, that the global economy and those markets really work smoothly to promote the use of recycled secondary materials, for example. And one overarching message that really came out, at least in my recollection throughout the conference, was that all stakeholders do need to be involved. We cannot afford to leave some people behind, and work really on those issues that matter for the hard-to-abate industries, and that includes national governments, regional governments, academia, research communities, civil society, as well as, of course, the industries and businesses involved.